Hi, welcome. I am so grateful for you guys to join us here today. I wanted to welcome you on behalf of JVP Central Ohio to this conversation on Palestine, and we are super excited to be hosting this event to with our co-sponsors. We have a long list of people here: JVP Albuquerque, JVP Detroit, Bay Area. If you want to like throw up a little hello there in the chat, we'd love to hear from you. JVP Cleveland, JVP Los Angeles, JVP Milwaukee. That's one for our other co-panelist Dalia. Yeah, JVP Northern New Jersey, JVP Sacramento, JVP San Diego, JVP Swarthmore, JVP Triangle, North Carolina, JVP Tucson, JVP Westchester, the Columbus Free Press, the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace, and ICAD USA. It's really exciting to have all these people together, continuing to raise Palestinian voices, and I'm so so honored to be here. As a member of that crew. So we are doing this event today with Anan Ameri and Dalia Gomaa to talk about Dr. Amri's new book, which is called The Wandering Palestinian. And we are doing this actually as a fundraiser for Shepherd's Field Hospital. And so I've just shared a link in the chat. And if you feel called to give some money, we've got a GoFundMe page, and we would love to receive your donations there. And we'll pass them on after the close of the event. Right now, I would like to introduce to you our two honored speakers. We are here to celebrate the second part of a memoir published by Dr. Anan Ameri. She's the recipient of numerous local and national awards in recognition of her work for really the Arab American community for much of her life, the Palestinian community, even when she was younger. She was recognized as the Michiganian of the Year in 2006. Access recognized her as the Arab American of the Year in 2020. She was inducted into the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame in 2016. And that's really a long list of other awards that I could be reading out here. She was born actually in 1944 in Damascus, Syria, in the home that she says many of her family members were born into, her siblings as well. She has a Palestinian father and a Syrian mother. And she spent the first years of her life in Jerusalem, and her family was expelled actually at the Nakba. And she was separated from her family. And she tells a lot of this story actually in her first memoir, The Scent of Jasmine. The family was eventually reunited, and they resettled in Amman, Jordan. She received where she grew up, and she received her bachelor's in sociology from the University of Jordan, her master's in sociology from Cairo University, and she moved at that point to Beirut, Lebanon, to do some research with the Palestine Research Center. She wrote as a journalist. She volunteered in refugee camps, and she eventually migrated to the United States, where she obtained her PhD in sociology from Wayne State University. I think she embodies the twin virtues of activism and scholarship. She's a scholarly activist. She's an activist scholar. And these commitments led her to serve as the first elected president of the Palestine Aid Society of America. She was the founding director of the Arab American National Museum, both of which you'll hear much more of today. She's also served as the acting director of the Institute for Jerusalem Studies in Jerusalem, a visiting scholar on the Peace Fellowship through the Bunting Institute of Radcliffe College at Harvard, and at Harvard University Center for Middle Eastern Studies. For over 4 decades, she has advocated for social justice and the rights of U.S. immigrants. She's authored many books and articles, including this 2-volume memoir that we are learning about and celebrating today. The first volume was The Scent of Jasmine, The Coming of Age in Jerusalem and Damascus, which was released in 2017. And now basically coming from her entry into the United States and her activism for Palestine from the United States, called the Wandering Palestinian, and that was released this year. So we are joined in conversation with Dalia Gomaa. She is actually a professor of English at Cairo University. She's the author of The Non-National in Contemporary American Literature, Ethnic Women Writers, and Problematic Belongings, which was released in 2016. She actually has taught also at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and Denison University, and she's also served as a Fulbright scholar. Her research interests span multi-ethnic American literature, US and Arab feminisms, transnational American studies, Arab American studies, North Africa, and Middle East literatures. Dr. Gomaa's research examines narratives that focus on the US female soldier in the war on terror, specifically in Iraq, from the perspectives of both Iraqi and US women writers. And I am delighted she's joined us here. She is a dear friend of mine, and I'm excited to be in conversation with her and Dr. Ameri. So let me add them to our spotlight. I'm doing all the tech here. Thank you guys so much for joining me. And I wanted to get us started by, we won't do this chronologically. I really wanted to start from the more recent, which was the foundation of the Arab American National Museum. And you write in the book about how one of the goals of this museum was to allow Arab Americans to tell the story of their history from their own perspective. And I wondered, why did you decide to tell your story, given that you had been working so hard to represent the stories of others? What led you to write these two novels, and this one in particular?
Actually, when I started writing these novels, I was never intended to write a memoir. I would just I always ponder about what makes us who we are and what make us choose certain path rather than the other. And I would jot down stories that have influenced my life or interesting experiences like that, surprising. Like, for example, when I went to raise money in Phoenix, end up in a nightclub, or, I write them down. And then when I retired, I pulled them out, and they've been written like in the 90s, some of them early 2000. I pulled them out and start going through them. And that when I start thinking of maybe they're worth publishing and start to talk about them in terms of, memoir. But really, maybe the work of the museum made me move into that direction with these things that I've written, because I also always kept a journal. And I was interested in people, when I said we want to tell the story from our perspective. And I don't think there's one perspective for Arab American. So the way the museum was constructed is that we ask individuals to tell their own story, like what brought you to this country, rather than we consulted with scholars in the field, but actually we let the people tell their own stories, what make them come to this country, or what experience they had in the US military, or whatever. We had the framework where we want, like we're looking at immigration, so we'll look at people who came to this country at different places or different times and let them tell us why they came, rather than say that's why Arab American came, because I don't really think there's one story. But one thing I was central to what we did is I always thought, like, I'm a first generation immigrant, or I'm an immigrant. I don't know how they define first generation. And I was born and raised in the Arab world and came here at age 29. I come from a Muslim family. We're not practicing religiously, but culturally. And my husband is third generation, half Lebanese, half Irish, born and raised in this country. How could him and I enter this museum and feel it reflects us? That was the idea, is that because the community is very, very diverse.
Thank you. I was asking Dalia about this because I was also interested in how to think about your book in terms of like literary traditions. And I don't know if you have a particular view, but I also wanted to invite Dalia to, because she sort of studies this stuff from the outside. Dalia, do you want to jump in here about how you think about her memoir, especially for people who are interested in reading around it?
Yeah, sure. I'd like to start first by thanking you very much for inviting me. You are a very dear friend as well, and giving me really a wonderful chance to meet Anan. It's I'm really honored to meet her and to get the chance to have this conversation with her. So it's a wonderful opportunity for me. And of course, yes, I was wondering, Anan, like when you were thinking of your, the initiative to think of writing your own memoir, were you inspired by other books? Because it is kind of, there are other Arab American memoirs. So let me start with this first, and then maybe I will have a follow-up question
No,
about other
two,
memoirs compared to yours.
two things. One of them is I really like reading memoirs, but also I like reading special genre of memoir, like political memoir or memoirs that will reflect the social and political timing, what happened. So I learn more than the one individual. It's like if you read, for example, Edward Said memoir, he put you in a certain place in Palestine, his family, and being in Egypt. If you read, Maya Angelou's, you learn about her story, but you learn more than the story. Okay, so that's one thing I always liked reading memoir. The other thing is that I think I'm influenced by the storytelling in the Arab tradition. When I grew up, there was no television. At best, as a family, we will sit around the radio to listen to Egyptian soap operas when we were young. But the main way of entertainment for people was to get together. And when they got together, they told stories. What happened in 1948? What happened when my uncle went to England? What happened this? What happened that? So that really, I was very interested in that. And also, I think that storytelling really keep memory alive. Like if something happened when you are 5 years old and nobody ever talk about it, as an unimportant event, you forget about it. But when people tell me when I was 48, I left at age 3.5, East Jerusalem, and my mother sent me Damascus, if they have not talked about it all the time, my mother talked about it, my uncle who drove us talked about it, my aunts who hosted us talked about it, I don't think I would remember. So I think storytelling also keep history alive, keep and give it a human touch, give it and I think storytelling is also bring people together because it's a shared experience. So that what really influenced my book, the way it's written.
Well, just following up on what you have just said, you mentioned a couple of times bringing people together when people get together. And I see this in your memoir structured around food at many places in your memoir. And it reminded me with other food memoirs. Yours is not a food memoir per se, but it reminded me with the language of baklava, how food and identity are kind of interrelated, or Food for Our Grandmothers by Joe Colley. But food in your memoir is very different. The presence of food in your memoir was actually kind of a site for sometimes tension, sometimes showing the generation gap between, freshly coming migrants from the Arab world versus um, generations of Arab Americans who were born and raised there, how they keep the food tradition, the urban versus the rural. There are so many things around food in your memoir, but I'm not sure. So would you like to reflect a little bit on this? Were you deliberately thinking of food as part of the Arab identity somehow here or there, or?
Actually, no, I was not thinking of food as such, but also what really struck me in terms of food, and also in terms of, I was married before to Abdin Jabara, and he was born here. He come from Muslim family. His mother came to the United States when she was 3, and his father came 18 in the in the end of the list, 1890 or something like that. She came at 1903. And her family homesteaded in North Dakota. And they want to preserve Arab culture. And they come from a very small village in Lebanon. So what to them Arab culture, or Arub culture, they used to call it, is what they know when they brought from Lebanon. So when I came here, my mother-in-law, which I really loved dearly, she was still making that very, very thin bread. She was making yogurt. She was making and cheese, canning. And she told me, I'm so happy Abdin decided to get a wife from the old country, because I try to teach my children to the tradition of, making the bread, and nobody want to learn. And when I told her we never made bread, she said, you never made bread in an old country? How did you eat? I said, we bought bread. You bought bread in an old country? And everything, when she called Lebanon old country, she never been there. And everything she knows is what her parents told her about what Arab culture is about. Well, I found interesting, maybe because I'm a sociologist by training, is that if you want to really study a community, an Irish community 50 years ago, go find an immigrant community that immigrated 50 years ago. They have tendency to keep it as is, as they recall it, as they remember it. Like when I grew up, change happened gradually. I lived different life a little bit than my mother. My mother lived life different than her grandmother. But change came natural, like change happened in all societies. Here, change means being Americanized, and people want to preserve their culture, so they preserve whatever they brought with them 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And that I found fascinating. And the food was an expression of that. Like they were farmers, so they grew their food in the backyard, which is now it's a trend. It's a trend in the United States. But that, and I came from a city, so that all was interesting to me, to say the least.
That's wonderful. So you describe many of the challenges that you faced founding the Arab American Museum, and the least of which was not like, who is this a museum of or for, and what would you preserve? And you talk a little bit about this in the book, but I would love to kind of invite you to say a little bit more about some of the challenges you had around that label of Arab American, and who's an Arab American? How does that relate to Arab and Arab countries?
There were two challenges. Number one, I was working for an organization called Access Arab Community Center for Economic and Social Service. It's 50 years old. It's a large organization. It's basically a social service organization with an art component. And the art component, what grew into the museum. So the question is that when we say we want to tell our story from our own voice, well, the assumption is two things. One of them, that Arabs has one voice and one story. The other thing is that we are the one who are qualified or entitled to tell it. And that really was something I want to be sure that doesn't get across, that we have many, many stories. And if you go to the museum, you will find the museum is really, most of the exhibits are about stories, individual stories. Whether like immigrant from Lebanon, Syria, from wherever they came. And we tried to bring somebody from every state in the union to be represented. We wanted Lebanese, Syrian, Moroccan, every Arab country, if possible, to be represented. And we want to be sure that, there's a balance. And the one challenge that we faced, and there's nothing we could do about it, is that a lot of the stories in the museum are about Lebanese. Either the individuals are Lebanese, they're not about Lebanese, but either the individual are Lebanese or they're Palestinian. And the reason for that is that the Lebanese are the community largest in this country. So whatever you want to write about, building institutions, you end up, the first institution were built by Lebanese American. If you want, and Palestinian, not because I'm Palestinian, but Palestinian tend to be more active than the general Arab activist, or involved. If you go to Access, the size of the Palestinian community is not that large, but the number of people who work at Access is larger than their proportion. If you go to ADC or any other Arab, and I believe that's because of our history, our past, we tend to be more involved in community work. So that was the other challenge we really faced, is that after we start building the museum, not building. We were just like, we made a decision to create the museum, 9/11 happened. We had already bought the building. We already start, discussing with consulting, with, consultant about the approach, talking to other museum, and then 9/11 happened. And 9/11 really affected us in a number of ways. One of them is that some people thought this is not the time for it, because it will only bring more attention to us. And is that what we really need at this point? Some people thought if you're going to invest that much money, which in the world of museum, $18 million is not really much money, but if we're going to invest that much money, there's other causes. And there's new refugees coming from this country and that country, and they need help. They don't need a museum. The third challenge is that some community members of the community that we have talked to, and they were willing to work with us and share their stories, they decided they really don't want to do that. And I give two examples. One of them was Palestinian who said that he came from the West Bank. He was deported by the Israelis and went to Jordan, and he ended up in the United States. And he didn't want his story because the United States is such an ally to Israel, and now it's going to reflect back on him. So he doesn't. The other one was an Iraqi guy who wanted to speak because, he came during the embargo. And his story was, you remember the first Gulf War, that there was an embargo against Iraq for a long time, and people were hungry and really miserable, and many children died. He managed to come under that circumstances. So when you ask him why you want to come, he told us, but then the second war started right after 9/11. And he thought by telling his story, he will be exposed in a way that he doesn't want to. Also, another challenge is like when we say an Arab American, in my mind and the mind of a lot of people, there are 22 Arab countries that are part of the Arab League, and Arabic is the main language, and these are the Arab countries. Some Lebanese, especially after 9/11, some Lebanese, especially within the Maronite community, they said, we don't want to do anything with the museum. We're Phoenician, we're not Lebanese. Or some Iraqi, they start saying we're Chaldean, we're not Iraqi. They did not want to be part of the museum. The attention we got, the negative attention we got scared some people from being part of it.
Just a little follow-up was that when I was starting my own research on Arab American women writers, I came across the long history of the Arabs in the US, which was never, it seems that 9/11 just gave visibility for the presence of the Arab immigrants. And throughout, the first generation of Arab Americans were not actually called Arab Americans. Then most of them were from the greater Syria region. And the Arab American label came into existence after 1967, which
Yes.
was kind of a response to the political situation in the Middle East or the Arab region, and how it was kind of a solidarity with what was happening there. But before then, it was the greater Syria region. It was not even Lebanon or Jordan. So it was all Syrian, and so I don't know, how much thought have you spent addressing this personally?
In the museum, we address it a lot. In the museum, we put it out there, and we talk about the AAUG, Arab American University graduate, as the first time the hyphenated Arab American. The earlier immigrant not only came from mostly Syria, Lebanon region, they call themselves Syrian, number one. Like if you go to Gibran and the, they were intellectual community in New York, they call themselves Syrian, not Lebanese. Or people make reference to their village, and they make reference to their village more than as after, the independence of Arab countries and the rise of, anti-colonial movement and what have you, people start to, and then identify themselves. I always say I'm Arab or I'm Palestinian, one of the two. when people ask me, what's your background? I'm Arab, I'm Palestinian. And I think there was a very strong Arab nationalist movement in the 50s and 60s that swept the whole region. Before that, you know, the Arab countries before the Second World War, we were all under colonial power, England. Some of us were, you know, between, you know, before the Ottoman. So some immigrant came, they were called Ottoman in the record. Some, yeah, because it was a part of the Ottoman, Syria and Lebanon. Some of them were called Syrian. Even in the immigration record later. But for the Arab community itself, the identity, hyphenated identity, has to do with two things. One of them is that in the United States, the hyphenated identity became more. Early immigrant, there were a lot of pressure on them. Those who came, like my husband's generation, parents who came in the beginning of the century, there was a lot of pressure on them to identify as American. Like my husband is Saleh, but actually all his siblings are Sally. They changed their name. They all have American names. The civil rights movement created a change in this country, and that allowed, first of all, immigration from non-European country was allowed. More people hyphenated, you start to say African American, you know, Native American rather than Indian. And that, of course, left its impact on the Arab American community.
It seems that this kind of debate also exists in the Arab countries. Like even in Egypt, for instance, there are, you know, some would not emphasize the Arab identity, but rather like the religious identity more than the Arab. So it's kind of, how do you define an Arab within the Arab American community in the US as well as within the Arab region? So it's not, I mean, what I got from your reading your book is that it is not a taken for granted identity. It's kind of contextual. Yeah, it's contextual, it's problematic, depending where you are, who you are talking to, even like from the same country, but one identifies as Arab and the other is not.
Correct.
I think that actually kind of takes us into this next question that we wanted to ask, and we'll sort of bat it between us, Dalia, maybe, right? So it seems like there is this tremendous diversity within the Arab American community, and it's for me, it was all over your book, all these different ways in which there was a kind of a diversity of and an effort to kind of dismantle stereotypes about the good Arab or the good immigrant or something like that, and who's authentic, who can speak authentically, the things that you've already said. So I wondered if you could share some stories that might kind of start revealing this diversity within the community. And maybe one that, and you've already kind of hinted at it a little bit, but maybe one that sort of talks about what it's like to be a first generation Palestinian American, marrying into a family that's second, third generation. What were some of the differences that you found?
You know,
Points of similarity, but differences.
I'm sorry. The main difference is when you are an immigrant, you don't become American overnight. You know, just because you landed on American soil, or you got your green card, or you get your passport, you don't become American in the pure sense, whatever that means. You still have, you in the first few years, you feel Palestinian. Then you start to feel American Palestinian. Then you start, but when you are third generation, you know, you're born and raised in this country. So your identity is clear. I mean, even one thing about 9/11 is that it's actually revived some of the identity of older Arab American. And also some want to distance themselves because Arab became a bad thing, while their other group, you find that their identity, Arab identity, although their second and third generation, have been heightened. So the other thing is that you find a lot about Arab American. The literature today about Arab American is much, much more than what existed before 9/11. Much more. So people, you know, people identity is how they feel. And also our identity is not stable. You know, during the election, you're a Democrat or a Republican, you know, during, if something happened when there's an issue about concerning women, like the right of abortion or the right of women to make decision, your identity as a woman become heightened. So I think we don't have one identity that we are this, but the longer you stay in any country, if you go tomorrow to France and decide this is where you're going to live, you're not going to feel French first day. Maybe it take you 10, 20, 30 years. So that's how identity evolved. And I think we feel different identity. Of course, culturally, we are different. They're more Americanized than we came. The last thing to go of an immigrant is food. That what, when I ask my husband, he say, my family is a tabbouleh Lebanese, That's what they sustain, kibbeh and tabbouleh. That's what culture, being Lebanese, means to them. So it means to different people. And also, like if you're political and you're like, for me, I'm political, I'm engaged, Palestine is really something at my heart. It affects my identity than other Palestinian who might not, for him, Palestine, too bad, it's like it happened with all communities, the identity is not felt as strongly with all the people all the time. Does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. I wondered if you might also say a little bit, maybe tell a story about how you began to realize a difference between aruba or village culture and you were identified as a city girl. Some of those stories.
My mother-in-law was a classic example. She came from village. Also, a large number of Palestinian in Durban. Durban is a neighborhood in a suburb of Detroit, and it has the largest concentration of Arab American in the country. Not the largest number, but the concentration. So you go there like you're in some Arab. And a lot of the people, Palestinian people and Lebanese immigrant, are from village. For example, when my friend, I talk about, Palestinian wedding, he told me, let's go to the wedding. And I said, I can't go, I'm not invited. He said, what do you mean you're not invited? Of course you are. They're going to feel bad if you don't come. I said, I can't go to a wedding, I'm not invited, And so I went, actually. I went and I was wondering if I'm making a mistake. And people are welcoming, they didn't know who I am. And they asked me, are you from Beit Hanina? That's the village where the wedding was. No. They kept asking me different questions. And then they said, she's Madaniya, she's a city girl. And my name was the city girl for forever. And I became their friends. And they were there, oh, you're just a city girl. That. Like the wedding, like everything happened. There's a much more communal culture that
In your book, you talk about what you wear and how what you wore was a little bit different from what other people wore.
So they all, have these Palestinian embroidered dresses, which they're beautiful, actually, the color of the whole. And also they have this like some kind of a cap, bigger than the Jewish cap, the cover like this, but all embroidered and have these coins, gold coins around it. I don't know if they're real gold or not. And lots of jewelries. And it's just like an exhibition of wealth and culture, your Palestinian dress. I go with a short, straight, simple black dress with a pearl, I think, or something like that. But like the woman said, why are you wearing black? You're not coming. This is not the Azza. Azza is like when somebody die and you go there wearing black, And we wear black when somebody die anyway, even in a city. But like you don't go to a wedding with a black dress. It's a wedding.
Can you say a little bit more also about how it was? I mean, you were talking a little bit about building an Arab American identity, but what it's like to be a Palestinian and talking about Palestine with people who are non-Palestinians. You have a bit of a discussion about that.
If you are talking about the Arab American community, okay, I think no cause that had more support within the Arab world people and the Arab American than the Palestinian cause. You don't find people who will tell you Palestinian, they don't have right, or they always acknowledge the injustice that happened to the Palestinian. But some people are more supportive or more involved or want to be more involved than others. So as a Palestinian within the Palestinian Arab community, it's not, and now come and talk to the public, that become a different story, If you give a lecture or you speak about I was at the Bunting Institute, and you give a lecture about, how Oslo changed what happened in there, and they call you anti-Semitic, and you want to give somebody embroidery piece, and that become anti-Semitic, and there's two things. Number one, I always say I'm a woman, I'm come from Muslim background, I'm Palestinian, I'm Arab, so I'm the embodiment of actually of everything evil, in the popular culture. If you're Arab woman, you're doomed. If you're Palestinian, you're a terrorist. If you're a woman, you're just some, So it differ, but there's a lot of people who also supported. When we built Palestine Aid Society, the membership was widely. There's a lot of non-Palestinian and non-Arab were in our organization. They were very, very supportive.
It seemed like another point of diversity, or another way in which you had a slightly different experience than other Arab Americans was around your sort of observation of racism in the United States. And I wondered if you could maybe tell some stories about, again, kind of complicating this idea about the Arab American being this unified thing. It seemed like there's a diversity of experiences
I
and
think Arab
observations.
American. I'm sorry, I jumped sometime too fast. The Arab American are not different. But we build a museum, I say, by telling the Arab American story, you're really telling the American story of people coming here to create a better life for them. We're not different. And I used to say, if a Greek American or Jewish American or whoever walk in here and he said, this is like my experience, we've done our job, because we're really not different. And within the Palestinian community or the Arab community, you'll find people are very supportive of, issues as it relates to African American, and we have our races too. I mean, it's like there are some Palestinian and some Arab who are not necessarily not influenced by racism towards other people. But what I found it when I came to Detroit, I was really struck because first of all, I come from an active family, progressive family. I came to age, at a time when there were international solidarity and non-aligned movement and African unity, all these concepts. So, and the civil rights movement. So when I came to Detroit, I was shocked. I was shocked by the poverty in the city. I was shocked by the deserted neighborhood. I was shocked that there's no public transportation. My mind till today cannot wrap around a major city have no public transportation. No way to get to a store, no matter what big or small you need, if you don't have a car. So it was a trap for me. And I felt I really lost my identity. I'm now dependent on this man called my husband for everything. And that really, I was resentful. But the poverty in America somehow has a harsher face. I don't know how to explain it, like when we're doing research and go to poor neighborhood inside Detroit, I mean, it's poor. It's really, and also because this is a very affluent country, everything is relative. And if you're poor, it's your problem. Like there's no sympathy towards the poor in this country. There's no empathy. Like if you're poor, you're done something wrong. If you live in a ghetto, it's your choice. And that was really bothersome for me, coming from where I came. And, when I see poverty, it's even worse. At least in refugee camps, when you go there, I don't know how many of you have been there, there's poverty, but there's some sense of pride. There's a sense of community. There was none of that. And that was really hard.
I think you've already kind of related this a little bit, but can you say a little bit more about how your own identity has changed over time?
When I came here, I was Palestinian. I was Palestinian. I had very strong Arab identity and I had very strong Palestinian identity. And they are equally strong. Maybe the Palestinian became stronger after 1967, but I felt just as proud to be Arab and I'm proud to be Palestinian. When I came to this country, as the longer I lived here, the more, whether I like it or not, you become Americanized. You pick up some of the culture, you pick up some of You see how other people live. So now if I go to Jordan, where my family live, I'm the American, and when I'm among American, I'm the Palestinian. So you don't feel alienated. When I came here, I felt very alienated. Very alienated. I didn't have friends. I didn't have a community. I didn't have a job. People looked down to Arab. People looked down to Palestinian. As time went by, I built communities within the Arab American community and outside the Arab American community. And I start to feel this is my life, this is my country, this is where I want to spend the rest of my life. And that's how you change. It comes gradual. It doesn't come overnight, and you don't will it. It just happens by the mere fact that you live here.
Thanks. I'll turn it over to you, Dalia.
I really want to pick up on the axis of evil that you described as being a woman, Muslim background, Palestinian / Arab, and talk with you about a topic that's really dear to me, which is feminism, and how the image of the strong woman is very different from the stereotype of the Arab Muslim woman who needs to be saved, as it is perpetuated. But before we delve into this, I want to reflect a little bit more with you on the mother figure in your memoir. I was so impressed with your own mother, and how strong she is, how inspiring she is. And it reminded me with my own mother, who had all these qualities, but she did not necessarily call herself feminist. She wouldn't even be interested in reading about feminism. And as an instructor who teaches transnational feminism, and the first thing that's always disappointing with the students is that I dismantle a lot of the stereotypes that they come in with in the classroom. So if you can reflect on the mother figure, your ex-mother-in-law and your own mother, and what acts that you, as a woman from the Arab world, would not necessarily look at as feminist, but yet it is perceived as a feminist act in the US, like the name, changing your name, keeping your name. So,
some things like we didn't name him, but that's the way they were. My mother was a working woman. She has a college education, and she owned her own business, a print shop downtown Amman, and all her staff they all were men. So I grew up like women work. She's the boss, she's the woman, but she's the boss, she owned the place. And she traveled when she wanted with her girlfriends. And my father was just as supportive. And I remember growing up, I was a little bit of a rebel when I was growing up. And my dad would tell me, listen, I don't want to do more than BA because I want to go do politics. And, you're young and he will tell me, you don't want somebody to tell you what to do. If you don't work and have your own money, I'm going to tell you what you're going to do. And if I'm dead, your brother's going to tell you what to do. And your husband's going to tell you. You can't come to somebody and say, can I have money to buy shoes? And then you say, I'll do whatever I want to do. No, he used to say, no women liberation without financial independence. But we didn't say this is feminism. Just my father's open-minded, he's supportive of my mother, he's supportive of it. And my mother used to say, if you don't have education, what you're going to do? What you're going to do? You're going to have, what kind of job you're going to have with a BA? And, so we grew up not like my mother had friends. Fadwa Tuqan was a poet who come and will sit in our backyard and read poetry. And she has other women who were different jobs. There were some women who are just, stay-home moms. But they never call themselves feminists. They never call themselves, they go into demonstration for women's rights, and they will go do charity work. So I grew up like women are equal to men, or should be equal to men, realizing that they are not in this world, but they should be. And that I was always told that I'm just as smart and as I'm just capable, and I'm just as, able to do whatever I want. And in the end, you have to be independent, take care of yourself. That was their goal. I mean, marriage was icing on the cake, but wasn't a goal. So I didn't think of it. So when my husband changed my name without asking me, and I was shocked. Like my mother's name was her maiden name. She has a combined name, Siham Jabri Ameri. My father's family. She added my father, but she didn't change her name. Many women don't change their name actually in the Arab world to their. Actually, this is the style. When you want to be Americanized or Europeanized, you become, that. So for me, it came natural. And talking about my mother, I want to tell a story about my mother. Okay. When my mother and I didn't see an eye to eye, and we fought all my growing up. We fought really hard, and only I became to appreciate her as I became an adult, not adult 18, in my 30s, I start to see how powerful she was and how much impact she has. We are three girls, and all of us have PhDs, the three of us. Actually, my older sister have 2 PhDs, which is weird, but she did. So she had a necklace, was a choker with pearl, and I always liked it. And she never wore much makeup or jewelry, neither do any of us. But that particular necklace, I like it, and I asked her to give it to me. And she said, no, this is a gift from my mother, a wedding gift from my mother, and I don't. She said, when I die, you'll have it. I said, I don't want it when you die. I want it now. Maybe I die before you. So we go into this argument, never managed to get there. So when I got married, a friend of hers came here and she called me and she said, your mom sending you a gift, wedding gift. You want to, what is it? It's a necklace. Oh, finally, my mother's giving me the necklace. So I go get it, and it's a necklace, but it's not the necklace. And I was really upset. And then I got my PhD, and my mother come to visit, and we pick her up from the airport. We come home, we're settling down, having coffee or whatever. And she kept saying me, oh, you make me so proud, Dr. Anan. She kept calling me Dr. Anan, you make me so proud. And then she take her purse, she take that necklace that I always wanted, and she gave it to me. And I was shocked. I said, Mom, I thought you give it to me when I get married. I thought I'll never see it. And she looked me in the eyes. She said, Anan, marriage is not an accomplishment. A PhD is. So that was my mother. And she had a lot of these wisdom moments, like when I got divorced and I want to talk to her. So as I grew up older, your mother is your mother. You don't really pay attention. She's a feminist. She's a strong-willed. She's working. Her staff is all men. You don't think, oh, she's your mother, And I used to always envy other friends of mine who will come home. We used to come home for lunch and then go back to school, whose mom are home and fixing them their lunch, and my mother was not there. And I used to feel jealous of that. But now when I grew up, I really realized how much impact she has on me and my other sisters.
I can really hear her voice when she was telling you when you were very depressed about your first marriage, it's not working. And the way I can really hear her saying, yeah, binti, yeah, habibti, that she's really, explaining to you that it's one thing to have a nice man, and it is another thing to feel really connected with with your ex-husband. So she was not upset about the divorce. It's not the end of the world, even though you were feeling, very
divorce is not
about
fun.
it.
I don't know anybody got divorced and thought it's fun.
But the way she was like trying to make a point,
Yeah.
telling you that here are the things that you are missing, that these are the things that you cannot see well.
Yeah.
So I really like reading about your mother a lot. But in a hypothetical world, if you imagine your mother coming to the US, like, what we may think of as transnational motherhood, would you think, like, this is kind of, a far-fetched question, would you think she would act differently? Like, would she still be kind of trying to stick to the cultural tradition, trying to, insist on certain dishes because this is how we identify as migrants in the US? Or do you think, like, imagine your mother in a different context outside, of course, she was she was Syrian, and she left Syria and left somewhere else. So, but it's different if you are moving between one Arab country and another, from an Arab country and the U.S. What would that be like? Like, just crossed my mind, this question.
I really don't know, but I know she came to visit me once, and she would, no, twice. I take that back. And she does not like this country at all, because she's an independent woman, and she go all over the place by herself. Here, if she want to go to the store, I have to take her. We live in Michigan, the car country. If everything we have to do for her, she just could not like to walk on the neighbor house and knock at the door and go walk in and have coffee in the morning. That doesn't happen in America. Or like to go to, downtown, walk around. There's no, so she did not really like it. I don't really know. I mean, it'll be all hypothetical and guesswork. How would be in this country? She's probably, if I'm like her, she would like, sir. I love certain aspects of this America. I really do. There are certain things only in America happen, but there are certain things that I really don't like at all. So probably if I'm her daughter, she would feel, and she had a strong sense of justice, my mother, fairness. And I think America does not, American have a strong sense of justice. America does not have it. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Yeah. This is a very nice threshold to what I'm going to ask you next. Speaking of things that you do not like in the US, like throughout the memoir, it's not a linear migrant story where there is a point of origin, which was bad, then you come into the US and then things are better. Throughout the memoir, I feel more that it is a perpetual struggle, like a continuous struggle for justice, looking at different aspects of inequality, which kind of, raises questions about the stereotype of the US as the land of opportunities, the idea of the American dream. Like, I personally connected very much with what you were saying when I first came to the US, and I was in Chicago, the third big city in the US, but I was not impressed. Like, why stores close at 7 at night? That didn't make sense to me at all. So it was kind of, no one really understood why I am not thinking of the US as that wonderful, wow kind of, place. So I was very curious to hear from you a similar kind of perspective on the US, the stereotype of the US as the American, and the American dream. So if you would like to elaborate a bit on your perspective.
I always say America, United States, by America, I mean, United States have the best humanity can offer and the worst humanity can offer, and they live side by side. They do. There is no doubt that America would provide certain opportunities to certain people that they cannot have in their own country. Like, for example, like if you are a very good doctor, and by the way, hospitals here are full of doctors, Arab doctors, and you want to do advanced research, or if you are in technology, you want to do advanced, like this Palestinian from Gaza who was, part of the Mars landing. You can't do it in Gaza, So there are, because of the country advancement in science and in technology, and they have the best university. The budget, when I went to Harvard, the budget of Harvard University was larger than the budget of the country of Jordan. So Jordan will never have Harvard, ever. Will never have a university that their budget is bigger than the whole country's budget. But Syria have wonderful universities where all these doctors come here and they're graduate of public universities. Like, I was totally shocked by the price of education in this country. I paid for my BA and master degree, and these are 6 years of college, less than I paid for one class in a private university in Michigan to get English I paid more for one class to learn English. And that's to me till today is mind-boggling that universities cost $30,000 and $60,000. You know, that's in my opinion is criminal. Actually, because you create a system that perpetuate poverty, like I lived in Detroit till recently on the east side of Detroit, adjacent to one of the most affluent suburb, Grosse Pointe. And the gap between the quality of schools in Detroit and Grosse Pointe is much more than the gap between the schools of Grosse Pointe and Amman, Jordan. Does that make sense? Does that what happened to Native American? We've forgotten, they as if they never existed at best, What happened to African American every day? I mean, there's a lot. If you're poor, if you're a person of color and you're not professional, this is very harsh life. People seek it, yes, from South America because life there is harsher, not because, So it has its good and it has its bad, but it's extreme also. The wealth is extreme and the poverty is extreme. I mean, the gap between the have and have not is just like, and some part of it is like a third world country. I'm sorry, but it is.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. It's one of the struggles also, like as when I teach the transnational feminism course, is that if students are not exposed to, the range of poor and rich, they wouldn't believe that, yes, there are some parts where it looks exactly like very underdeveloped and neglected and economically impoverished. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much. I want to ask you one more question, but also just prime our audience that we would like to reserve some time for direct questions. So if anybody does want to ask a question, I'll read through the chat and try to find you. And if you wanted to voice, we can remove the unmute thing. But as I plant that seed of a thought of asking some more questions from our audience, let me give you one more question. So I think one of the things that the pandemic has taught us, but I think we were already talking about that before, is thinking about the statelessness of the sort of ongoing statelessness of the Palestinian people as a kind of trauma. And that's a new, from my perspective, that's a new way of thinking about this. And that comes with, it's a double-edged sword, because I think there's a lot of stigma around naming trauma and claiming trauma and living with trauma. And I was inspired actually in your book about how open you were and how you talked about, when and how you sought therapy. And yet you had these very different experiences. And so I wanted to know if you might share some of those stories, with our audience, and maybe reflect a little bit about trying to seek support for trauma.
I came to this country, as I mentioned in my book, because I met my first husband in Beirut, Lebanon. I actually interviewed him for a newspaper, and we're falling in love. I came here. I was, fascinated by him, and I got married. And then as time went by, the marriage did not work. So it was very, very hard for me to get out of it. I wanted the divorce, but it was very painful for me. So I went to therapy, trying to find people, talk to people initially, maybe not to get divorced, whatever, when you're in bad time, you get divorced. And what struck me actually, I think, is that the lack of understanding of minorities among professionals, maybe now it is not the case, but like I remember, and I write about it in my story, one therapist was telling me, do you play music? No. Do you play tennis? No. Do you, I don't know what, golf? No. Why? Your parents didn't teach you how to play music? No. Did they love you? And I said, how do you come to the conclusion that I didn't learn music to love me? My parents were a Palestinian refugee. They gave me education. I didn't have $1 to pay for my student loan, They pay for everything. So he said, were their parents poor? And he insisted that we were poor. And we weren't poor by any stretch of the imagination, but like, why are you ashamed of admitting you are poor? I said, this thing is not for me. So I quit going there. But the imposition of like, if your parents love you, will give you music and tennis lesson, and we'll drive you here and drive you there. We walked every place. Nobody drove me any place, but they were bus and they were service. Then when I went to Washington, D.C., a friend of mine was telling me about this wonderful therapist that she really loved and convinced me to go see her. And she was African American. And she asked me about to make a list of what I have in life and what I lack. And then she said, do you have a nice house? Yes. Do you have a good job you like? Yes. Do you have a lot of friends? Yes. And she kept saying, why are they not among the list of good things you have in life? And it's really, she made a paradigm shift in my thinking. That woman, she was African American. She's seen poverty. She's been destroyed neighborhood. She was the head of a Peace Corps. So she traveled internationally. So whining, like now during COVID, when I usually go to Spain every winter, and I was very disappointed I didn't go to Spain. And I said, Anan, you should be ashamed of yourself. People are dying and you're crying. You can't go to Spain. So, but maybe if I haven't went to her, I wouldn't you would think there are a lot we think that we are entitled, in that sense of entitlement. I think if you come from a middle class or privileged class, you feel it's like she felt like I act like an entitled person, and the other guy said you're poor and you don't want to admit it. But it's a different of, I love her. I still have a lot of fun memory with Dr. Payton, but it is the cultural gap, we call it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that you mentioned in the book is how when you decided to end your therapy with Dr. Williams or Joseph?
Joseph, yeah.
Joseph.
No, William,
he was very much against it. He said, I really think that you're going to be in therapy for the rest of your life and that you should take some pills. And, and then a few years later, it was, you found Dr. Payton. You were with her for 6 months. And at the end of it, she actually told you were done. And and you were a little
she did.
surprised.
She said, I think you're okay. I'm here anytime you want to come and see me, I'm here. But I don't think, you need my service anymore. You're doing okay.
Yeah. So I was wondering about, so I want to invite people, to ask questions in the chat. But so I was wondering about some other things that you reflect on in the book. You talk about organizing and fundraising. That's the hard work of organizing. Oftentimes, is paying the bills. And you would travel around the United States, and you would go to raise money. And a lot of progressive politics is around coalition politics. And you recount a story. Can I read it to you? You recount a story where you go to New Mexico, and you observed a small affluent Palestinian community is how you describe it. And you said they controlled the wholesale market in arts and crafts of Native Americans. And it sort of didn't sit quite comfortably with you. And you went to a reservation and you this is what you write. You say, although I've been to many Palestinian refugee camps, nothing had prepared me for the level of poverty and despair of Native Americans. The similarity between the fate of both people who lost their lands and independence to outside settlers did not escape me, nor did the irony of Palestinian merchants who were refugees themselves getting rich off Native Americans. I also wondered if I was their partner in crime by accepting their donations. I was able to justify it by telling myself it's a gift from one oppressed people to another. And I was wondering if you could say more about that thought that you had.
In every community, one person does business, and then his whole relative or relative follow. So somehow Palestinians settled in New Mexico and in Gallup and in Arizona, and they end up, all have gift shops of Native American arts and crafts. And I still have a lot of it, actually. I was given to me as gift. So I found that fascinating. So I asked a friend of mine who I was staying with, and he has a store. He was going to go pick up an order from Native American camp and or settlement, and I said, can I come with you? And I end up going with him, and I was really shocked. I hear it's something to read about poverty and something to be there. And they did their business. He paid them money, he took their whatever, and we're driving back, and I'm asking him, and he's a very, very nice guy. I said, how do you feel about this? You know, you're getting rich out of them. He said, as long as I pay them a fair price, I don't feel guilty about what I'm doing. You know, they're going to sell their jewelry. They want to sell their jewelry. They want to sell their good. And I don't feel, as long as I pay them, I don't feel like I'm being exploited of them. And when I thought about their gift, I'm talking about not the Native American gift to me, but I'm talking about Palestinian. In every store I go there, the whole story, I go there and Asad will introduce me and they will give me a donation. And that I was referring to the money they are giving me, that they made it out of profit from Native American. And then it's a gift from Native American to Palestinian people, one oppressed person to the other.
So we have a few questions in the chat. One question was to ask you maybe to talk more about the 9/11 exhibit in the Arab American Museum. So maybe describe it for people who haven't been there. And then were there any sort of deliberations about how to include it or what to emphasize?
We don't have anything about 9/11 in the museum, which is interesting, you know. I don't know, maybe when I talked, I gave the impression that we have something about 9/11. The museum was perceived, you know, to be there before 9/11. And we discussed actually whether we should include something about 9/11 or not. And we decided not to, because we decided that we should not be defined by that moment as a community. We opened in 2005, but we had to submit all the writing and all the exhibit material to the exhibit design a year in advance. So we don't have, but there is one thing there. There's a letter that went to thousands of Arab American that came from the FBI, telling them that they will want to talk to them. Not that they think they are, accused, not that they think that they had anything to do with 9/11, but nonetheless, they would like to talk to them. And that created really big panic within the Arab Americans. So we have that letter, but we stopped actually the immigration story and at 201 or 202, because we have to open 205 and we have to, but we didn't include it. And there's nothing about 9/11.
I mean, do you think, because I do think that, I mean, so it makes sense to me not to say anything about 9/11 insofar as there was no Arab American that was involved in 9/11, but it does seem to me that there was a huge impact that the community had. And I wonder if you think maybe 10 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, when the museum
we've done things
is alive.
after. We've done things after. We've done like 10 years after 9/11. We've done lots of program about 9/11. But no, it's not part of the permanent exhibit.
There was another question about, it says, we need more stories for children and young adults from Arab Americans, not just for Arab American children, but for all young people.
There are actually some other,
great.
Arab
Can you share
American,
those names with us?
There's Naomi Shihab Nye. She writes nice stories for children and young adult. And there's Suzanne Darraj, I think her last name. Also, she's right now publishing. She's a young and she's emerging writer about Arab American. I'm sure there are more, but this is the two come into my mind. There's one Najjar, her last name, and I don't remember her first name.
Thank you so much. Dalia, was there, I don't know if you know any children's literature. Was there any books that you would add to that list?
Not Arab American, but The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros is kind of every young adult who is interested in reading it. So it's, I think it's a children's book for me. I don't know.
Thank you so much. So we have a question that says, could you comment on the role and types of religion that are part of Arab culture?
You
This
know,
may be 101, but I think it's helpful to kind of be,
I mean,
yeah.
comment on the, can you read this again for me? So I answer.
I think that there might be a stereotype. I mean, we were talking about the diversity within the community, and there might be a stereotype that it's all Muslims.
You know, in the United States, actually, until today, the number of Arab Christian is higher than, you know, Muslim Arabs. Yeah, Arab American Christian, or their number is more than Arab American Muslims. Because historically, the United States were much more open through the churches to allow Christian into this country from Lebanon and Palestine and every other place. So today, the Arab world, I mean, and a larger percentage of the, like for example, Palestine, there was a very large community, Palestinian Christian community, but there's hardly any left now. Between 67 and now, there are hardly any left. It's easier for them to migrate, and they happen to be in Jerusalem and Bethlehem area that Israel really have a very strong hand on. So, and if you have 100 Christian immigrate to the United States and 100 Muslim, because they're a minority, it affects their percentage more. So here in the United States, you know, maybe there's 55 to 45 more Christian from, and mostly from Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and Jordan, the Christian community. And Egypt, of course, you have the Coptic community.
I wonder if we can talk politics for a second. I was thinking about chapter 13, your road trip to go to the conference, where, sorry, what year was that?
75, I
75,
think.
yeah.
I was not here long, yeah.
And where you were debating the one-state solution. And I just wondered, we had on, our chapter had hosted Jeff Halper, who has now started supporting, the one-state solution. And so I just wanted to know, you know, what are your views on this? What do you think of as obstacles? What do you think? What do you think is likely here?
Jeff Halper was very active with Palestine Aid Society in Los Angeles, and he went with me on one of the trips delegation I took to Palestine. So I've known him. I've kind of lost contact with him. You know, if you look at the history of the PLO without all the propaganda and what have you, the PLO suggested at one time that we have one state, and it was in the language, one person, one vote, regardless of the religion. Muslim, Christian, and Jews can live as country with equal rights. And then in 1974, the concept of two-state solution was introduced because Israel said that one-state solution, the PLO presenting, they want to throw us in a sea, and they want, you know, if you remember, the Arab want to throw the Jews in a sea. And so the idea came that we should start with two-state solution in the occupied territories, including Israel, all the territory occupied in 67. And the concept is that the Israelis feel very strongly that they want a Jewish state, and they're not ready to live with other people at this stage, maybe in a future. But for now, at least we can recap, you know, there's a support for Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories. We're still talking 1974. And that two-state solution, I was an advocate of two-state solution, while many Palestinians were advocates of one-state solution. And as time went by, the idea of two-state solution gained a lot of momentum. But thanks to the Israelis, they make their settlement and confiscation of lands make today, we don't have possibility of two-state solution, because there's no way, as I see it today, that Israel will be willing to give the land occupied in 67 or get the settlers out. I mean, most of the land is now confiscated, and Palestinians live in small pockets like apartheid, separated from each other. So I don't think, I'm really now, I came back to believe that our fate is one state, whether the Israeli like it or not, whether the Palestinian like it or not, because we have an apartheid system, and that system will collapse sooner or later. Will collapse. Today, it sounds hard to believe that it will collapse, especially when yesterday there was demonstration in Jerusalem, kill the Arabs and burn their villages, and these were the slogans, you know. So it's hard to see, and Israel is moving more and more to the right, and you have these supremacists, but that doesn't last, you know. Or maybe I'm naive, but like, who thought that South Africa will collapse? You know, we woke up one night and Mandela was out, and it came from the, you know, the president of South Africa at the time. He said this cannot last, you know. And the United States was the last soldier in support of South Africa. I remember that.
I mean, one of the things that we've been thinking about in our chapter is sort of trying to more fully embrace the settler colonial analysis. And I was thinking about this in your book when you started talking about freeways. Freeways in the United States, freeways in Israel, because it seems to me that a one-state solution is not a post-colonial solution. It could be a perpetuation of settler colonialism. So I wondered if you could share those reflections that you had on driving freeways in the United States compared to driving freeways in Israel.
You know, I always, in when I learned driving, how to drive, everybody told me to stick to the freeways. You know, you don't want to go through neighborhoods. You want to, it's not safe. Stick to the freeways. And as it turned out, you know, it goes through African American neighborhoods. And if you drive on the freeways in Detroit, inside the city, Detroit is full of freeway inside the city, you know, and that's how we move from one place to another. You find like there's trees on the side of the freeway to hide, you know, the rundown of the city. So I always say, take you where you want, but it shields you basically from the poverty, the harsh reality of Detroit. I was in South Africa one time, and I got stuck in traffic, and I was asking the driver after Mandela came out during the negotiation between the African and the, you know, during the negotiation, was not like already ended apartheid, but there were negotiation. And the guy was telling me when we got stuck in a traffic, like, this used to be such a nice freeway, we used to zoom in it. Now they let this African out, and there's too many African. And I look at him and I laughed. I couldn't help it. I said, but sir, this is Africa, you know. And he looked at me and he's like, I felt like he's gonna hit me, this guy. I said, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I meant it just like, it's just like Palestine, too many Israel, too many Palestinians there. And you go to the West Bank, and I went to a settlement one time because I'm with delegation, so I have taken settlement, not that I like to go. And the woman with a New York accent, and she's talking about the settlement history, which is history, I mean, it's 10 years. There's no history there. And it was built on Palestinian land. And somebody asked her, how do you feel about Palestinian, your neighbor, they're poor and they cannot come here. And there's for Jews only road, you know, you can't, nobody can go there. You go if you want to go settlement. And she said, well, they're poor and they're lazy and they don't want to work and they want everything handed to them. Exact language that is used to describe African-American in this, if you talk to a racist person. So, you know, oppression has the same face, you know, whether you're talking about African-American, whether you're talking about Black in South Africa or Palestinian, and the oppressor have the same logic. Too many Blacks, too many Palestinians, you know.
Thank you. One question from Farrell Brody. What about all the Jews who lived for so long in Arab countries? Farrell, do you want to unmute yourself? Let me do this. Farrell, do you want to ask your question in a little bit more detail?
Well, you know, for forever and ever, and in Arab countries, as well as in other countries like Spain, Jews and Muslims got along very, very well. In fact, I mean, there were large Jewish communities all through the Middle East, not just in Arab countries, in Iran and other places. They got along so well until Israel came about in 1948. Things began to change. I just wanted to hear comments, you know, about that, if you have any. Your relationship, for example, with Jews in your life.
I didn't have relationship with Jews in my life till I came to the United States. I mean, I have to admit it, because if there was a shopkeeper in Syria, there was the gold market in Syria, and there were Jews running these stores. There were a lot of them in Syria running these stores. I wouldn't know if they're Jews or not. I wouldn't, they were Syrian. Just sometimes if you walk in a store, you don't know if the owner of the store is a Christian or a Muslim unless they have a sign that indicate they're like. I know from my father, who grew up in Jaffa and then become refugee till 48, is that there were Jewish community in Palestine before, and some of them were his best friends. And the first Communist Party, I don't know if it was called Communist Party in Palestine, it was they were like both people in it. But what happened after 48, Israel really, really put pressure. They want people, they still want people. So the Arab, hostility toward Israel at the time became a good excuse to lift, bring many Arab into, with the promises of better life and more money. And, so many Jews many went from Arab countries to, but I mean, if you think about that region is the place where the three religions existed. And the truth of the matter, there's so much similarities. I mean, it's not like if you compare Buddhism to Islam, it's not like Christianity and Islam, and Judaism, they're not in essence very different religion. There's a lot in common. But the hostility came when the Zionist movement decided that they want to create a Jewish homeland or state on a piece of land that was inhabited by majority non-Jew. And I don't think there's a nice way to do it. How do you transform a country or a piece of land or a region that the majority of the population are not Jews? There were some Jews, to a majority Jews, and allow people, if you are Jewish, you are a citizen, doesn't matter which country you are, and you want to transform this, and you wanted a Jewish state, you either kill him or kick him out. There isn't a nice way. It's not like they could do it in a nice way. The whole concept of a Jewish state on a land that inhabited by the majority of non-Jews is not a, and if you see what happened to indigenous people in many places around the world, it doesn't work. You either live with them, but then it's not a Jewish state because there's too many of them, or you kill them, or you get rid of them. That's where the problem, I think the problem is not that the concept doesn't work in nice means. You cannot transform that country from majority Palestinian, Arab, and Christian with a minority Jews into a majority Jews, overwhelming majority Jews, in a nice way. You can't do it in a nice way.
Thank you so much. I mean, this for us is galvanizing a lot of conversations that we've been and learning that we've been doing. I mean, within the Jewish Voice for Peace, we had a huge conversation several years ago about Zionism and whether it made sense to make fine-grained distinctions between cultural Zionism and political Zionism that sought to do this kind of work of creating a state around this particular attachment to the land. And we thought a lot about cultural Zionism, and Jeff Halper came and spoke to us and sort of said, hey, there's still this cultural Zionism out there, but it's hard to see it when you have a nuclear power state and a state that has a huge amount of military aid, passing laws that make Arabs second-class citizens, and making Hebrew the official language of the state. It's very hard to see the cultural Zionism in the midst of all of that political Zionism that is continuing to deny the Nakba. So. Anan, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us. Dalia, thank you so much for elevating our conversation.
Thank you.
Bringing this transnational perspective. I really appreciate it. I would love to tell everybody a little bit more about some other events that we have coming up. Okay, so We, again, would love to encourage you to submit a donation to the Shepherd's Field Hospital. I'm going to throw the link in the chat for all those who have joined us a little bit later than the original. And this is a hospital that would like to reopen and is a little short on funds. This recording is actually going to be posted to our YouTube channel. And so if you're interested in learning more about our YouTube channel, you can go there and see some of our previous events. And if you'd like to get on our email list, you probably already are because you had to register for this event. But if you'd like to contact us directly, you're welcome to do so. And I'm super excited to sort of preview an event that's being organized by JVP Detroit. They're organizing an event that is about these two new definitions of anti-Semitism, and I think it gets to some of the stuff that we've been talking about with criticism of the State of Israel. And so they're hosting this webinar because there are two recent definitions of anti-Semitism, one from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IRHA, and another definition from the Jerusalem Declaration, which has been endorsed by over 200 leading intellectuals. Both of these definitions are trying to help us understand what is anti-Semitism and what is not anti-Semitism, but they come to pretty dramatically different conclusions about how anti-Semitism relates to Zionism and to criticism of the policies and actions of the Israeli government. So if you want to learn more about these new definitions and how they might, if they gain widespread approval, how one or the other might impact political debate in the United States, freedom of speech, First Amendment rights, I really hope and recommend that you can come to that. Oh, great. Thanks, Barbara. I was just about to share the link, but that is a link to where you can register for that event. And then our next conversation is on June 1st. We're super excited to be joined in conversation with Omar Barghouti. He's the leader of the BDS movement, and you can we'll be sending around Zoom registration information after the event. So thank you all so much. I want to thank all my local organizers here, Connie that does all the tech and makes sure that the Zoom is around. Farrell, who makes sure that the Zoom is paid for, Michael for really building a community that's we're increasingly realizing how much we need to be connected to other efforts, and so he's really getting us internally to our chapter to be connected more broadly, and I'm super grateful for him pushing us to do that work that sometimes is a little uncomfortable. Bonnie for keeping us well fed. I'm really just grateful for all the people locally that really enrich my life. And so with that, I will thank all of you for coming and look forward to seeing you in a month. Take care.